Good evening and welcome to another edition of Law and Order, brought to you exclusively by Channel I. Tonight we will be continuing from last week's episode on the conservation of Sri Lanka's environment. And once again we're joined by eminent lawyer Mr. Ravi Algama, who counts more than 36 years in the legal profession. Thank you, sir, once again for joining us on Law and Order.
My pleasure.
Just to recap, sir, last week we spoke about the hierarchy of protected areas in Sri Lanka. Would you like to just recap that a little bit for the benefit of our listeners,
Yes.
of our viewers?
Just to recap,
Yes.
In order of the degree of protection they receive, these are the strict nature reserves to which people are not usually allowed in, except under very limited circumstances. The national parks, to which people are encouraged to enter but to behave responsibly. The nature reserves, jungle corridors, marine reserves, and finally sanctuaries.
So now, as you correctly pointed out, each of these protected areas afford a great degree of protection to the wildlife and habitat, the natural beauty in these particular areas. But if an individual is violating any of the provisions of the laws that ensure that these areas are protected, I believe it's under the Fauna and Flora Act, am I right?
Ordinance.
Ordinance.
Yes.
So, what should we be cautious of as citizens of Sri Lanka? For example, if we visit Yala, what do we have to be cautious of? How do we conduct ourselves in such a national park?
Well, within Yala, there is no necessity to exercise that degree of caution, because you can only be accompanied, you can only enter if you are accompanied by a departmental official who is generally referred to as a tracker. He is a guide who will be with you throughout your stay inside. Even if you are an occupant of a bungalow, he would be with you overnight. So he will obviously advise you about the do's and the don'ts inside a national park. Of course, it's just a common sense approach of being responsible and appreciating that the parks belong to the animals and the plants, and the cities belong to us, and we must be mindful that we are being tolerated by them for a while.
So, is there any kind of penalty? For example, sir, if, as you correctly pointed out during our show last week, in a national park, you cannot stray beyond the track that has been allocated for these safari jeeps and so on to traverse. But if an individual does stray, what are the penalties that are involved, or what should we be cautious of such instances?
I don't sort of offhand
of course,
remember the specific
not,
sentences or the amounts of the monetary penalties, but all these are punishable by law, including in unauthorized entry to a national park, where most of the carrying a firearm within a national park, of course hunting, collecting firewood, or any such activity, human activity, is completely prohibited inside nature reserves. But limited human activities are permitted in sanctuaries if you traditionally had a right to engage in those practices. I told you that the other method, apart from declaring large extents of land for nature conservation, is declaring certain species as protected.
Yes.
Now the important thing is, usually earlier they used to have schedules to the Fauna and Flora Ordinance with the kinds of protected animals. But it has been our experience that many new species are found, particularly in birds. When I started bird watching in the 1970s, we used to think that there were like 420 species of birds in Sri Lanka. Today there are over 450.
Oh.
Even as lately as a few years ago, an endemic bird found only in Sri Lanka was found in the Sinharaja forest, an owl. So, which had escaped identification for this length of time, with so much of studies being done on ornithology in Sri Lanka. So but unfortunately, if the protected animals are listed in the Act, to bring new species in, by the time it goes through the processes of legal draftsmen, attorney generals, so many readings in parliament, by that time, that species is bound to be extinct. So therefore, from the amendments from the early 90s, we started a new experiment where we have this concept of negative listing. Only the unprotected animals are listed in the schedules to the ordinance. And therefore, everything else is
considered
naturally protected. So when it comes to birds, it's basically the paddy pests. Sri Lanka is an agricultural country, and that is why when you see vikurullas, the munias being sold, put inside cages, or the rose-ringed parakeet, malagirava, and a few of the other birds being caged, you can't do anything about it because they are not protected species, because they are considered to do some harm to agricultural properties. When it comes to mammals, the only large mammal which is unprotected is the wild pig. But of course, the transport of its flesh or its carcass is prohibited by law, because if you also liberalize its transport, then of course there will be large rings of poachers, and there will be big sort of organized large scale killings, which may then decimate the species beyond a sustainable population. So, but if a villager were to kill a wild pig, he must make sure that he cooks the fellow where it is killed.
I see. Without transporting the carcass.
Yes. So it's a bit of a ridiculous situation, but then that is the law.
Affords some form of protection.
Yes, correct. Then of course, when it comes to reptiles, it is the 5 deadly snakes that are unprotected. That's a policy decision. Well, I don't really think that they deserve to be classified as unprotected, but then if you speak to someone whose child or a parent has been bitten by a deadly serpent and has succumbed to that situation, it's very difficult to convince them that we have to protect these animals as well. So it's the Russell's, the cobra, the Russell's viper and the saw-scaled viper, 2 vipers and 2 kraits, Karavalas, the Ceylon krait, Sri Lanka krait and the Indian krait. Those are the 5 considered the 5 deadly species. Even though saw-scaled viper, I don't think we have a adult Sri Lankan who has died as a result of the bite of the saw-scaled viper. In India there have been, maybe the Indian subspecies has more potent venom. But still we have child deaths reported with saw-scaled viper. But nevertheless, those 5 species, all other species of reptiles, including serpents, turtles, the terrapins, tortoises, the lizards, yes, the water lizard, water monitor and the land monitor, and the crocodiles, 2 species of crocodile, all are protected species. So that is for different categories of offences. Particularly the tuskers and buffaloes the tuskers and elephants and buffaloes, there are separate punishments which are very high right now for killing or for, but then there are so many other forms of death that these beasts suffer. Like from recent times we have seen the number of railway accidents
Yes,
from
that is
which
true.
many elephants have.
It's quite unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate, and it's most likely that the scenario is that only herds with babies, because elephants have very good vibration sensitivity, so no elephant would willingly stay on a track. So it is likely that it is to save a baby elephant who was on the track that a mother or an aunt got knocked down as well. It's very sad, but on the other hand, you can't tell the railway department that they have to go at 20 kilometers per hour for 100 kilometers. So there has to be a solution which people are now working on. Let's hope something will come
indeed,
about.
because we don't want to come upon a time when the memory of an elephant is all we have.
Exactly.
So, would you like to touch upon the forest ordinance?
Yes.
What are the provisions of the forest ordinance which provide for the protection of our
Forest ordinance is also the same vintage as the fauna and flora, 1938. Both departments came about, forest department and the wildlife department came around at about the same time. The emphasis of the forest department was not pure conservation initially, but it was sustainably managing the reserves under the purview of their department so that human needs can also be met. So we cannot really find fault with that sort of policy. We live in houses which use such a lot of wood for its construction, for the roof, for windows, the lintels, then even the pencils we use, the paper that we use, everything requires certain amounts of wood or wood products for their manufacture. So the forest department used to, generally the State Timber Corporation and the forest department would come under the same ministry traditionally, and there have been situations where these departments have gone, for instance, hand in hand. For instance, if you see some of the forest reserves in the out of Colombo, it is not uncommon to see a State Timber Corporation depot on the other side of the road.
That's true, yes, come to think of it, yes.
So it is for that reason, but in more recent times, the forest department also has taken into consideration the denudation of forests, particularly in the wet zone, and many of the forest department forests in the wet zone especially are now, many of them are for pure conservation. Of course, the jewel in the crown is the Singharaja forest, which is under the forest department. The Singharaja, the Kanneliya, Dadiyagala and Nakiyadeniya reserves, Knuckles, and the parts of the Adams Peak wilderness. There are many, Gili Malay, Bambara-Botua, lot of wet zone forests which are maintained purely for conservation, but the forest department also has a sustainable program of harvesting timber for human use.
So, it has been said that the forest cover in Sri Lanka, which was once quite substantial, is dwindling at a very fast pace.
Yes.
Would you, in your opinion, only in your opinion, sir, would you think that the regime of laws that are currently in force in Sri Lanka is sufficient to stem this tide?
Well, I personally think laws alone will never be able to control a situation like this. It is basically a political decision which must filter down to people at all levels of society in order to protect and further enhance the resources that we have. The president of our country has made a declaration nationally and internationally that he has an ambition of increasing the forest cover of our country to a fairly large percentage, and it is fortunate that the forest department also comes under the purview directly of the president of our country, and he is the Minister of Environment, under which the forest department comes. So we can only hope that things would be better in future.
So sorry, yes, go ahead.
No, there are also a few other laws like the Coast Conservation Ordinance.
I was just about to get into that actually, yes.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Coast Conservation Act, and there are, within the Act, there is a narrow strip of land which is like 300 meters inland from the coastal, from the high water mark or the low water mark, and 2 kilometers out to sea, a narrow strip right round the island which is identified as a coastal zone. Any developmental activity within that coastal zone must have the approval of the Director of Coast Conservation, and that would be discretionary on the director if he is under the impression that this will not create a large impact on the coastal ecosystem. He can give permission straight away, but otherwise, if it will have significant impacts in his opinion, he will call for an environmental impact assessment. In 1981, when the Coast Conservation Act was brought into effect, that was the first time that the concept of an environmental impact assessment came into the statute books of Sri Lanka. Environmental impact assessment is something like a prophecy. It's you're projecting what are the not necessarily harmful, it could even be beneficial effects of a project which you're trying to start in 30 years, in 50 years, or even in 100 years. It's a management tool, as it were, which can mitigate certain effects of environmental degradation and incorporate those into the planning process straight away from the beginning, rather than address the damage once it happens. Here in the planning stage itself, you can bring in safeguards. So that is the importance of an environmental impact assessment. And today we have a National Environmental Act which deals with largely with two aspects: with environmental pollution, which is the basically environmental protection, and the approval of projects. That is on the basis of an environmental impact assessment, where certain kinds of projects, and depending on the magnitude of these projects, like a highway which is over 10 kilometers in extent, or a power plant which is over so many megawatt of electricity generation, or clearing of land over so many hectares, conversion of land, forest land to other purposes, there will be the requirement either of a full-blown environmental impact assessment or of an initial environmental examination, and which will thereafter be submitted to these project approving agencies, and it will only be on the basis of approval based on an EIA that these projects can be started and implemented.
So who carries out this environmental impact assessments?
There are different forms of, there are different kinds of consultancy firms of engineers and environmental consultants, but the responsibility is on the project proponent. The person who is trying to start a project, he has to, or that company will have to come up with the environmental impact assessment report.
So, in other words, these laws do not prevent development, but it seeks to mitigate and minimize the impact, the adverse impact on the environment.
Yes,
is that so?
It is so. That is so.
So, once an EIA, an environmental impact assessment report, has been submitted, If it is the conclusion that this would have too great an adverse effect on the environment, is there a possibility for the company, the proponent of the project, to change how this project will be carried out?
Yes, they can. And that's the very idea of an environmental impact assessment, because you're addressing these concerns at the earliest stage.
Right. Yes.
So the decision at that stage would be that the project would be disallowed, but they can certainly modify and come up with different kinds of sort of conditions and different things. They can study of different aspects of it to make it to addressing the reasons why the project was disallowed, and that can always be resubmitted for approval.
I see. Well, sir, we are fast approaching the time that we have together discussing such an interesting topic, which I'm sure all our viewers are interested in. In conclusion, is there any thought that you would like to leave with our viewers when it comes to, as a lawyer and also a Sri Lankan who loves the wild? I mean, I understand that you love to visit the wild, and you were talking about how us city dwellers should go once in a way to these national parks and be one with nature, so that we can relax and come back rejuvenated. But whilst we enjoy this beauty that we have in Sri Lanka, as a lawyer and as just a citizen who loves the natural beauty that is around us, what thoughts would you like to leave with our viewers?
I would basically that we must show respect to these areas that we visit, which are so useful to us to, as I said earlier, to recharge our batteries. We must leave those places, if possible, in a better position rather than in a worse state. The littering is one of the worst things we notice in national parks. There are plastic bottles, there are biscuit wrappers, there are so many things which people just callously throw out of, which I cannot even imagine in such a pristine environment that a person, and sometimes I don't know whether you can even blame them, because people don't even have a thought for it. It's just something that you see the same thing happening in the posh Jaguars and the Audis also. People roll down their shutters and put down Mars or Bounty wrappers out of their windows. But when it happens in wild areas, it is very, very sad. And these make very unwholesome feasts for animals, unsuspecting animals. Recently, a whale washed ashore in some country had 300 kilograms of plastic waste inside its belly.
And that's what caused its death.
Most likely, it could be.
Thank you, sir, for those concluding thoughts. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is all we have time for. And as Mr. Algama so beautifully articulated, it is our duty as citizens of this country to protect the natural beauty that we have been blessed with. And I do hope that this evening's program would have encouraged you to do just that. And with that, we come to the end of this week's edition. Let me once again thank you, sir, Mr. Algama, for taking time off your schedule to be with us today. I'm sure our viewers really appreciated what you shared with us.
Thank you.
Good night.